Well, thanks, Todd, and thank you, everybody, for coming out this afternoon on this long weekend. Just one correction, Todd, I didn't actually give up my practice to do this. I retired after 32 years of cardiac surgery. You know, it's interesting, I just digress before I even start. You know, I thought it during my practice as a cardiac surgeon, as a transplant surgeon, I could help one person at a time. In this role, I feel as though there's the opportunity to help millions. And that is my motivation. Now, before I begin, I know this is going to seem a little bit awkward, so bear with me, but I want to pay tribute to our former Prime Minister and the people that elected him. In the immortal words of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, as you know, was a brilliant lawyer. He was an anti-colonial nationalist, and he was a champion of civil rights and freedom around the world, and he led the independence movement in India. And here's the quote: "If an idiot is in power, then those who put him there are well represented." Now, having said that, it's crystal clear that the people in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Central, and Northern BC didn't put Mr. Trudeau in power. And neither did the people in those areas put our current Prime Minister in power, who without question is far more dangerous than our former PM, mainly because he's very much more intelligent. He's very articulate and he's very persuasive. But what is of great concern to many of us is, if you look at his book published in 2022 regarding values, he's made it very clear that he feels as though Western civilization is morally rotten to the core, consequent to capitalism. And he feels very strongly that in order to solve this, you're going to have to significantly restrict personal freedoms, certain industries, certain agriculture, and to control the financing of anything that is counter to the environmental social governance metrics that he is in favor of. So, before I go on, I want to take you back to 2003. So some of you may have heard this question before, and I'm certain that the panel members have. In 2003, I was at the annual general meeting chatting privately of the Provincial Conservative Party, chatting privately with my friend Ralph Klein. And I said to Ralph in January of 2003, I said, "Ralph, I think I have a solution to fix the dysfunctional relationship between Alberta and Canada." And he looked at me, he says, "You do?" And I says, "Yeah, I think so. Would you like to hear about it?" And he said, "Absolutely." And I said, "Okay, well, it's based on this question. If Alberta was already a sovereign nation and you were the president or the prime minister of the sovereign country of Alberta, would you want Canada to join Confederation under the current terms and cost of membership?" And he looked at me and he smiled. And I'll always remember these words. He said, "To ask the question is to know the answer. Of course not." And I said, "Well, I'm glad you said that, because don't you think then that you have a moral, ethical, and economic responsibility to fix this dysfunctional relationship?" And he said, "Yeah, I guess I do." And I said, "Well, I'm working on a paper that once it's completed, I think will give you the algorithm, the pathway to solve this problem." And so over the next few months, I worked on this paper, and I had input from a number of other professionals, non-professionals, MLAs like Ted Morton, and federal MPs like Don Mazankowski, and many other people. And I met with Ralph in August of 2003 for about an hour and a half in his office and talked about the key points. The document was entitled Alberta at the Crossroads, Status Quo, Refederation, Autonomy. In my mind, autonomy meant Alberta sovereignty, Alberta becoming an independent nation. But the essence of it was leverage. It was the means to solve the problem of the imbalance in power between the federal government and the provincial government. And that leverage can only come from a referendum on Alberta sovereignty, because there's no other way to force the opening and changing of the Constitution that in any way could meet the requirements that Alberta would like to see happen. So, well, what does sovereignty really mean? And I like to just touch on this for a second because in a very simplistic way, sovereignty means self-governance without external interference. And if we take it down to the individual level, you are all sovereign to an extent as an individual. You give up your sovereignty, that is, being in charge of controlling your future, controlling the what you are willing to buy in terms of goods and services. You give that up when you let another authority regulate you. You give that up when you let other authorities or governments take your money from you, which prevents you from purchasing the goods and services that you want for yourself and for your family and for your future. So think of sovereignty at the individual level. At the provincial level, it means something similar, doesn't it? Why is it that Bill 1 was passed by the UCP government? Bill 1 was the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act. Why was that enacted? Because the federal government kept encroaching on provincial constitutional authority, and it was costing us a lot of money, not just from this usurpation of our constitutional authority, but also the taxation that comes. Example, the carbon tax. So if we look at all of this in perspective, how did this all come about? And why are we in the mess that we are in? Well, the fix was in really from the get-go. You know that Alberta was incorporated along with Saskatchewan, September 1, 1905. Thanks to the efforts of Sir Clifford Sifton, the Minister of the Interior of the Liberal government of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And I think it's very important to understand what he said to an audience in Winnipeg in 1904. Okay, so listen carefully. What he said to an audience in 1904, and it's in his book, Clifford Sifton, Volume 2, it's on page 95. What he said was, and I quote, "We desire, and all Canadian patriots desire." Now, Canadian patriots in 1904 were not anybody living in Alberta, in the regions of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Canadian patriots were the people living in the East. "We desire, and all Canadian patriots desire, that the great trade of the prairies," that's Alberta and Saskatchewan's wealth, "that the great trade of the prairies shall go to enrich," who? "Our people in the East, to build up our factories and our places of work, and every legitimate way contribute to its prosperity." Where did Alberta and Saskatchewan fit into that? We started off as a colony. We continued to be a colony, regulated into the ground and pillaged and plundered for the benefit of the East. And what can we do about it? Well, not very much, because really, to address the irritants, of which there are many, it requires opening and changing the Constitution. And the constitutional hurdles are impossible to overcome. So, how has this now been manifest? Well, we have lost over $800 billion given to Ottawa, consequent to equalization, consequent to the national energy policy, and consequent to other confiscatory policies from the federal government. And we haven't received a cent in return. And remember, it's already been touched on with respect to the national energy policy, the brainchild of Marc Lalonde, the Minister of Finance in the Pierre Elliott Trudeau government, who said, in justification of the national energy policy, we could not, quote, we have this on video, we could not let Alberta become the center of economic power in Canada, which it was becoming in the late 70s. All right, now when we look at this from another perspective, what have the policies generally been? Well, they've been anti-Alberta energy, you'd all agree with that. They've also been anti-agriculture. They've been anti the development of other natural resources. And it's already been touched on, but there's an update for you. The amount of money that we have lost in the last decade, or 14 years or so, has been $500 billion, not $100 billion. This was planned investment into Alberta, which has dried up. Why? Because of federal regulatory and taxation policy. This has also been articulated by our Premier. Moreover, as a consequence of not being able to get our oil and gas to international markets, we are losing roughly $26.5 billion every year, per the research study just released not too long ago, just a few days ago, by the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And then we look at the issue of values. Well, we have a very different value set. We're not particularly interested in keeping our natural resources in the ground. We're not particularly interested in a central bank digital currency, which will control every aspect of our life. We're not particularly in agreement with diversity, equity, and inclusion policy or environmental, social, and governance policy. And we're not particularly keen about having our property confiscated, i.e. the firearms confiscation plan. And property rights, believe it or not, as David Lametti, the former Minister of Justice, has stated, Canadians don't have property rights. Canadians do not have the right to own property. And what's important about that is that if they can take your firearms, they can take anything from you. And that is absolutely true under our current Constitution. So let's look at health. Well, the World Health Organization pandemic treaty has been signed on to by the federal government. That means that something more like we faced with COVID could certainly come again, in which your freedoms and your mobility are completely restricted yet again. The Premier, though, has said that health is a provincial responsibility, and we're not going to listen to the dictates of the World Health Organization. That may be true, but guess what? Let's say, for example, the federal government wants to restrict your freedoms and your mobility because of some other pandemic. What can Danielle Smith do about that? She could say, well, we're not going to follow those dictates, which is implicit in what she said earlier. But how does the federal government then respond to that? The federal government responds by withholding transfer payments, right? So we give $70 billion a year to the federal government every year in taxes. We get back about $27 billion in transfers, federal transfers, social transfers, education transfers, health transfers, infrastructure transfers. So compliance is forced on a province, and this has happened multiple times, by withholding transfer payments. So we really don't have as much control as the Premier would suggest. And then let's look at the issue of our economic growth. Some of you may know that In terms of industrialized nations, Canada's economic growth is dead last. Why? Because of federal regulatory policies and taxation. So what can the Premier do about this? What are the demands that she's made? Well, she's made a number of demands, hasn't she? Notwithstanding to the former Prime Minister, but also to the current Prime Minister. And what has she said if we don't get these policies recognized in favor of Alberta? She said that, well, that's going to be a threat to national unity. But there are a number of things that she hasn't included in terms of clout, in terms of actually opening and changing the Constitution, such as, for example, taking control of federal taxation, getting out from under the inefficiencies of the Canada Health Act, ending equalization. These things require opening and changing the Constitution. So what has happened? Well, to try and get our way here in Alberta, there are some 18 lawsuits that have been launched by the provincial government against the federal government in a number of areas. Is that any way for a federation to operate? I don't think so. And with respect to litigation, litigation takes years and sometimes decades before it's finally resolved. Do we have that much time? I don't think so. Ladies and gentlemen, the solution for all of this really is for Alberta to become a sovereign nation. And there is a pathway, to achieve that. And it's been defined legally by the Clarity Act. And so we at the Alberta Prosperity Society, which governs the Alberta Prosperity Project, are following the letter of the law. But the benefits, just imagine this. We would be completely out from under all federal regulation and all federal taxation. And what would that mean for the average Alberta worker? Well, we've done the calculation. It looks like this. The average Alberta worker makes about $78,000 a year. But after all those taxes that person pays, he's left with actually $31,000 to $35,000 of actual purchasing power. Everything beyond that goes to taxes, one form or another. As a sovereign nation, that same individual would pay 8 to 10% maximum, meaning that he would have or she would have $68,000 to $70,000 of that $78,000 for actual purchasing power. What do you think about that? And of course, it's going to be variable depending on the tax bracket, but I thought it would be reasonable to look at the average worker in the province of Alberta. So that legal pathway to get out from under the oppression of the federal government in terms of regulation and taxation is defined by the Clarity Act. So the process is as follows. In May 2022, the Alberta government under Kenney passed the Citizens Initiative Act. Now, in order to have a referendum on constitutional change, according to the current legislation, which is still in place, it would require 600,000 people signing a petition to open and change the Constitution. And that those petition signatures would have to be collected within 90 days. So we at the Alberta Prosperity Society thought, well, that's impossible. So we came up with a workaround that not even Mr. Kenney could have contemplated. Sneaky. So what we decided to do is we said, well, we can't collect 600,000 signatures in 90 days, but what we can do is we can collect the contact information of 600,000 people. And once we have done that, then what we can do is we can submit the petition question to Elections Alberta. They can certify it, give us the canvas petition sheets, and then we can go out and collect the actual signatures on the petition. But now we know where to go because we have the contact information with everybody. Now, in addition, many of you are aware that Bill 54 has gone through second reading and has achieved royal assent, but has not yet been proclaimed into law, and that won't happen until June. But the new threshold has been reduced from 600,000 to 177,000. And for your edification, the Alberta Prosperity Project already has the contact information of something north of 250,000 people. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to get to that actual original threshold of 600,000, 800,000, or 1 million, and we expect to be there by the end of August or September this year. Now, okay, so the process is as follows. We submit a petition according to the Citizens Initiative Act. It gets certified as a legitimate question, and we go out and we collect the signatures. Those petition signatures are then verified by Elections Alberta, and once verified, the petition is validated and it goes to the provincial government. Then it's up to the provincial government to hold the referendum. Now, they hold a referendum, and if the referendum is successful in terms of meeting the objectives of a clear question with a clear outcome, then the provincial government, for the first time in history, has solved the imbalance in power between the federal government and the provincial government, and now can negotiate from a position of strength. But that Clarity Act makes it very clear that if you're going to have a question on Alberta secession or any province wanting to leave Canada, you have to mean it. You can't be going into a referendum on Alberta sovereignty with the idea that you want to negotiate a better deal. The Clarity Act makes that very clear. So, therefore, the intent of the referendum then will be absolutely for Alberta to leave Canada. Then the negotiations are what's the outcome going to be for a sovereign nation. That's the way it works. Now, there's another thing that could happen, and there's a nuance here which I find quite fascinating. You'll recall, some of you, that when Kosovo declared its independence in February of 2008, following a successful referendum, it unilaterally declared its sovereignty. Do you know which two countries were the first to acknowledge Kosovo's sovereignty? Japan and Canada, 1 month later. So what I'm getting at is international law recognizes the will of the people as expressed in a referendum. And if it's a sovereignty referendum that meets the thresholds, then the international community, acknowledging that region's or that new country's sovereignty, legitimizes it by recognizing it and creates trade agreements and other sorts of arrangements with that country. Do you know which country would be the first country in the world that would acknowledge Alberta's sovereignty? The United States. We know that. All right. Now, I'm going to close with the same question that I posed to Ralph Klein to all of you. If Alberta was already a sovereign nation and Canada came to us and asked us if we would join Confederation under the current terms and cost of membership, is there anybody in this audience that would want to do that? No. All right. Okay, now here's your challenge. I set you up beautifully for this question. It is now your obligation, just like I said to Ralph, don't you think you have an obligation then to help us steer this bus towards Alberta sovereignty by getting other individuals also to register your contact information, that you will support a petition on sovereignty that will lead to a referendum on sovereignty. And I encourage you, therefore, then to go to the website, albertaprosperityproject.com, and register your intent to support the petition and get as many other people as you can. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.